This next section relates to academic freedom in curriculum and instruction. I'm going to go over some of this, and some of this I'm going to ask that you read ahead on. Academic freedom, by definition, permits teachers to speak freely about their subject area, to experiment with new ideas, to select appropriate teaching materials and methods. Academic freedom in court cases have been upheld on several levels based upon the First Amendment of free speech. It protects a teacher's right to evaluate and criticize existing values and practices in order to allow for political, social, economic, and scientific process. It should be noted that academic freedom is not an absolute, that there is a balance against educational values that courts have decided cases on. You need to also realize that academic freedom or insubordination to that which an administration requires or is in violation of community standards. The courts have ruled that as long as materials presented are relevant to the subject and appropriate to the age and maturity level of the students, and a very key phrase that you will hear again and again in law, does not cause disruption to the educational process. Actually, the phrase is does not cause substantial disruption to the educational process. They are allowable in a classroom. However, let's take a look at a couple of cases. I'll ask, even though I'll give you the answers in just a few minutes, I'll ask that you research this first and then look at the answers. The two cases that come to mind are Presentation versus Rutland, a 1969 case, and Keefe versus Giannakis, a 1969 case. In the first case, the teacher signed Welcome to the Monkey House by Kurt Vonnegut. She was counseled by her administrator not to teach this literary garbage. The result was that she was dismissed by her school district. However, take a look at the case and see how the courts ruled for or against the teacher. The second case, the teacher assigned an article from the Atlantic Monthly, pretty conservative literary magazine called The Young and the Old. However, the article contained the MF word that many adults, note the word adults, found objectionable or dirty. Now, the case you should know in the second case, the Keefe case, is that this was presented to a group of seniors. It was not a group of younger youngsters who read this article. The objection was an adult objection, not a youngster objection, and again the district moved to dismiss the teacher. Now I would play the Jeopardy music here for just a moment, and then go on and talk a little bit about the Presentation case. And just to paraphrase, the judge looked at this case and said, well, the Supreme Court has emphasized that academic freedom, the right to teach, evaluate, and to experiment, is fundamental to a democratic society. However, on the balance, academic freedom, like all other constitutional rights, is not an absolute and must be balanced against competing interests. School officials cannot restrict First Amendment rights unless they first demonstrate that the forbidden conduct would materially and substantially interfere with school discipline. Therefore, the court in this case agreed with Presentation that her dismissal was an unwarranted invasion of the First Amendment right to academic freedom and ordered that she be rehired. In the Keefe case, the judge found the article was scholarly, thoughtful, and thought-provoking. If it raised the issue of incest, it was not to suggest it but to condemn it. He went on to comment that no proper study of the article could avoid considering the word. He doubted that quoting a dirty word in current use would shock these high school seniors, or that they needed to be protected from such exposure. The decision concluded that the sensibilities of offended parents are not the full measure of what is proper in education. I would also like to refer you to several cases having to do with academic freedom in curriculum and instruction. The Tinker case. The Tinker case is one of the premier cases in this area. Tinker versus the Des Moines Independent School District. The Tinker case decided that it's within the prerogative of the state or local district by default to determine what the school curriculum should be. The School District of Abington Township versus Schempp, the Michigan Appellate Court in 1963, talked about that curriculum development is to be at the school level and should not be decided by judges. The Sandlin versus Johnson case in California, where a group of second graders sued for promotion because they didn't complete a reading series. The Indomitio versus Rhinex School District in 1996, the requirement that mandatory community services graduation doesn't violate students' constitutional rights. And Law versus Nichols, a very famous ESL case, which talked about the failure to provide English language to Chinese-speaking children, violated the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We'll discuss that case further. I would encourage you to go back into the text and look at each of these other cases and perhaps develop some case briefs relative to them according to the assignment sheet. I also now would like to talk briefly about Indiana Public Law 221, which is the accountability law. Every state in the United States has an accountability law. They all have different numbers, of course. In Indiana, it was a major law adopted in 2001. It established benchmarks. It established 4 levels of diploma. It talked about full credit of certain courses in physical education. Talked about proposed interventions based on school improvement plan goals, professional development, and discussed timelines for implementation, review, and revision. It discussed technology accessibility and the use of technology, community, business, and higher education partnerships, the percentage of grade 3 students reading at or above grade level, and we'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment, and a comparison of the state assessment information and dropout. One of the outcomes of Public Law 221 became a requirement in 2011-2012 that all grade 3 students be tested for reading accomplishment on a test called iRead. Students unable to pass the test are mandatorily retained by the state of Indiana in grade 3. They can then attend summer school and retake the test at the end of the summer. There are exceptions for ESL students and special education students. The law goes on to discuss what your school improvement plan should look at, and there's a slide that discusses that, and the changes to the school improvement plan. This has become a very major act in terms of impact on education and the evaluation of schools and teachers. It has morphed into current law, which is Senate Enrolled Act 575, which requires teacher evaluation outside of the contract, and Senate Enrolled Act 1, which prescribes certain compensations based on 33% for experience and degrees and 67% for performance. I now would like to talk a little bit about the Indiana Administrative Code. You will find codes in your state that cover much of the same area, defining attendance rate, school board, and in our case, both elected and appointed school boards, educational proficiency standards, graduation examinations, which are currently called the end of course assessments, soon to be called PARC, the Partnership of Assessment for Readiness of College and Careers, principals, students, subject areas, teachers, completion of Core 40. Core 40 in the state of Indiana, the 22 most important courses towards college readiness, and the electives that follow. Of a student in grade 10 in semesters or trimesters. Curriculum requirements are covered in a separate article. Requirement for commissioned schools, both public and charter. Types of credits permitted, non-credit programs. Graduation requirements. Academic honors is one of the 4 diploma types. There are academic honors and technical honors. Waiver graduation requirements for special education students and required and elective credits. The state of Indiana, as many states have, accreditation procedures. There are several pieces of documentation that must be provided to the state of Indiana and other states to be accredited each year. Now, this is outside of the accreditation of Advanced Ed or the North Central Association or the Atlantic Association or the Western Accreditation Association. These are the general principles of curriculum, which I believe, even though they are in law in Indiana, are pretty national in their focus. Developing individual responsibilities for learning and personal actions, addressing the unique needs, personal interests, and capacities of each student, providing for the mental and physical well-being of each student, contributing to each student's intellectual, social, vocational, artistic, and expressive growth, and providing opportunities for students to recognize their potentials and be prepared for a lifetime of learning and applying these general principles. Further, you'll note a lot of information about No Child Left Behind. Now, No Child Left Behind in many ways is very controversial as it requires certain benchmarks and has penalties built into it. It is the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act that goes back to 1965, I believe, might be 64. When Lyndon Johnson was president. I only want to cover a little bit of this, but I will encourage you to read through the rest of the PowerPoint to understand the basis of No Child Left Behind if you're already not familiar with it. The purpose of this act, or this title, is to ensure that all children have a fair, equal, and significant opportunity to obtain a high-quality education and reach at a minimum proficiency on challenging state academic achievement standards and state academic assessments. And then the act goes on to discuss 12 specific parts that are required under No Child Left Behind, or the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 2001. You'll also notice sections relative to adequate yearly progress. We know that Title I schools in particular are impacted by AYP. Under new state waiver requirements that the government has provided to some states, these provisions of No Child Left Behind have been waived, allowing for the state to have in place a teacher evaluation system and school evaluation grading system, if you will, for each of the parts that would have been covered under No Child Left Behind.